Before we dive into today's story, I want to give you a strong disclaimer. This is one of the most troubling and unsettling narratives found in the Bible, and it may not be suitable for all viewers. The story I'm about to share is not only graphic, but also raises deep moral and spiritual questions. If you've ever experienced trauma, this video could trigger certain feelings. So please be cautious as we explore the depths of this historical event. This is not your typical Bible story. It's found in Judges chapters 19 through 21, a time when the nation of Israel had no king and every person seemed to be doing whatever they thought was right in their own eyes. And the result? A horrific event that culminated in national chaos, tragedy, and civil war. But before we get to the lessons this disturbing story offers, let me first walk you through the events as vividly and carefully as possible, so we can truly understand the gravity of the situation. Only after we explore the depth of the story will we uncover the powerful lessons hidden in this shocking narrative. So let's jump into Judges chapter 19. The story begins with a Levite man, someone who should have been among Israel's spiritual leaders, living in the hill country of Ephraim, a region in northern Israel. This man had taken a concubine, a woman from Bethlehem in Judah, located in the south. While concubine may sound like a lesser status than wife, she was still regarded as part of his household, with responsibilities and expectations much like a wife. However, the relationship was far from ideal. The concubine had been unfaithful to him and eventually left him, returning to her father's house in Bethlehem. She stayed there for 4 months, and during that time, the Levite seems to have come to terms with her betrayal. He decided to reconcile, journeying from Ephraim to Bethlehem to bring her back. Upon arriving at her father's home, the Levite was warmly welcomed. Her father was eager to host him, so much so that each time the Levite tried to leave, the father would encourage him to stay another day. Day after day, this back and forth delayed their departure. Finally, after several days of hospitality, the Levite insisted on leaving. Despite the late hour, they set off on their journey north, heading toward the hill country of Ephraim. As night fell, the Levite, his concubine, and his servant needed a place to rest. They approached a city called Gibeah, which would later be known as Jerusalem. But the Levite was adamant about not staying in a city where foreigners lived. His reason? It was not an Israelite city, and he likely feared a lack of hospitality or safety. So he pressed on to Gibeah, a city of the tribe of Benjamin, hoping for a better reception. When they arrived in Gibeah, they waited in the town square, as was customary, expecting someone to invite them in for the night. Hospitality was a vital part of the culture during this time, and it would have been considered a serious breach of social norms for a traveler to be left outside. Yet no one offered them shelter. As the night wore on, an old man returning from his work in the fields saw them and asked why they were still out in the open. Upon hearing their plight, he offered them a place to stay. The Levite assured him that they had their own provisions and wouldn't be a burden. They only needed a place to rest. Graciously, the old man welcomed them into his home. Just when it seemed the night would pass peacefully, a terrifying event unfolded. Wicked men from the city gathered around the old man's house and banged on the door. They demanded that the Levite be brought out so they could sexually assault him. It was a shocking and abhorrent request, one that echoed the infamous story of Sodom and Gomorrah from earlier in Israel's history. The old man, desperate to protect his guest, tried to reason with the mob. "Please, my brothers, don't do this wicked thing," he pleaded. "This man is a guest under my roof. Don't commit this vile act." In a horrific turn of events, the old man offered his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine to the crowd instead, urging them to violate these women rather than harm the man. The thought process here is hard to comprehend. The value of the women's lives and dignity was being weighed as less significant than the honor of a male guest, and the consequences of this decision would be devastating. When the mob refused to listen, Levite made a shocking decision. He took his concubine and forced her outside. The men seized her, and throughout the night, they raped and abused her until morning. This brutal assault continued until dawn, and when they finally let her go, she managed to crawl back to the doorstep of the house where she collapsed, utterly broken. As morning came, the Levite opened the door to leave. There, lying at the threshold, was his concubine, her hands reaching toward the door. Without any visible remorse or concern, he coldly told her, "Get up, let's go." But she didn't respond. She was dead. What follows next is almost incomprehensible in its brutality. The Levite, upon returning to his home in Ephraim, took his concubine's lifeless body, dismembered her into 12 pieces, and sent each part to the 12 tribes of Israel. His intention was clear: to provoke outrage and force the tribes to act like they did. When the tribes of Israel received the grisly pieces of the concubine's body, They were horrified. They gathered together in shock and anger, saying, "Nothing like this has ever happened or been seen since the day the Israelites came out of Egypt." They demanded justice, but the matter was complicated by the fact that the perpetrators were Benjamites, members of one of Israel's own tribes. The other 11 tribes sent a delegation to the tribe of Benjamin, demanding that they hand over the men responsible for the heinous crime. But the Benjamites refused to comply. Instead of delivering the guilty men to face judgment, the tribe of Benjamin prepared for war against the rest of Israel. What followed was a brutal civil war. The armies of the 11 tribes went up against the tribe of Benjamin, and thousands of lives were lost on both sides. Despite the numerical advantage of the 11 tribes, the Benjamites initially held their ground, inflicting heavy casualties. However, after several battles, the tide turned, and the Benjamites were nearly wiped out. Only 600 men survived, fleeing to the wilderness where they hid, while the cities of Benjamin were destroyed, and their women and children were killed. The 11 tribes had succeeded in bringing justice, but their victory came at a terrible cost. The tribe of Benjamin, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, was on the brink of extinction. After the dust settled, the other tribes began to realize the gravity of what they had done. They had nearly eradicated an entire tribe from Israel. Now, with only 600 men left and no women, the tribe of Benjamin faced the very real possibility of dying out completely. In an effort to preserve the tribe, the other Israelites devised a plan. They had made a vow not to give their daughters to the Benjamites, but they found a loophole. They attacked a nearby city, Gibeah, killing the men and taking 400 young women who had never been married. These women were given to the Benjamites as wives, but even this wasn't enough. There were still 200 men without wives. To solve this, the Israelites told the Benjamites to go to Shiloh during a festival and kidnap women as they danced. This way, the Benjamites could take wives without technically breaking the Israelites' vow. The plan was carried out, and the 200 remaining men seized wives from among the women of Shiloh, ensuring that the tribe of Benjamin would survive. Now that we've explored the events of this horrific story, let's reflect on the lessons it offers us today. As shocking as the story is, there are profound truths to be learned from it. 1. The dangers of no accountability. The story opens with a critical statement. In those days, Israel had no king. This wasn't just about the absence of a monarch. It represented a time when there was no accountability. People did whatever they thought was right in their own eyes. Without accountability, people are prone to stray, to make decisions in isolation without regard for consequences. When we lack a moral compass or someone to hold us accountable, we too can drift into dangerous and destructive behaviors. 2. Every person bears the image of God. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this story is the way women were treated as less valuable than men. The Levite and the old man were willing to sacrifice their concubine and daughter to protect the male guest. This reveals a deeply flawed understanding of human worth. In their minds, the dignity of women was subordinate to the safety of men, and this mentality led to unspeakable tragedy. This dehumanization of women is a stark reminder of the importance of recognizing the inherent worth of every individual. The Bible teaches that all people, men and women, are created in the image of God. Genesis 1:27. When we fail to see others as image bearers of God, we open the door to atrocities like those committed in Gibeah. It's a reminder that we must challenge any form of discrimination or objectification in our own lives and in our society, treating every person with the dignity and respect they deserve. 3. The danger of straying from God. The book of Judges, as a whole, shows a nation in moral decline. As we move from one chapter to the next, the people of Israel seem to stray further and further from their covenant relationship with God. In Judges 19, this spiritual drift reaches its climax with the horrifying events surrounding the Levite and his concubine. The further we stray from God, the more vulnerable we become to doing things we never imagined we would do. This story stands as a powerful warning about the dangers of turning away from God's ways. When we neglect our relationship with God, when we become complacent or indifferent, we open ourselves up to moral failure, both as individuals and as a society. In modern times, this can manifest in subtle ways. We may compromise on our values, engage in destructive behaviors, or allow injustice to flourish around us. It's only by staying close to God, by remaining anchored in His truth, that we can avoid falling into the same traps that Israel did during the time of the Judges. 4. One bad decision leads to another. This story is a vivid example of how one bad decision can snowball into greater destruction. The decision of the Levite to sacrifice his concubine led to a series of escalating consequences. Her death, the dismemberment of her body, the outrage of the tribes, and ultimately a civil war that claimed tens of thousands of lives. Once the tribes of Israel made the decision to go to war with Benjamin, the consequences spiraled out of control. They ended up nearly annihilating an entire tribe, leaving behind only 600 men and no women. In their attempt to right one wrong, they created a new moral dilemma that had far-reaching consequences. This lesson is crucial. We can choose our actions, but we cannot choose the consequences. Once we make a poor choice, we often lose control over how the results unfold. Sin, once unleashed, tends to have a ripple effect, harming not only ourselves but also those around us. Just as Israel's rash decisions brought about widespread devastation, our own choices, when made without wisdom or guidance, can lead to outcomes we never intended or wanted. 5. God's grace in the midst of our failures. Despite the horrific events in this story, there is still a glimmer of hope. While Israel's actions led to the near extinction of the tribe of Benjamin, God allowed the tribe to survive. The remaining 600 men were given wives, and Benjamin was able to rebuild, preventing one of the 12 tribes of Israel from disappearing forever. This speaks to the profound grace of God, even in the midst of our worst failures. The Israelites made countless poor decisions, and yet God allowed redemption to come out of their chaos. The tribe of Benjamin, though severely reduced, was not wiped out entirely. This is a reminder that no matter how far we fall or how much destruction we bring upon ourselves, God's grace is still available to us. In our own lives, we may face the consequences of bad decisions. We may experience loss, regret, and brokenness because of our actions. But God's grace means that even in the darkest moments, there is the possibility of redemption. He can bring healing, restoration, and even new beginnings, no matter how hopeless the situation may seem. Let's now revisit the civil war that followed the outrage over the concubine's death. The 11 tribes of Israel demanded justice and called upon the Benjamites to hand over the men responsible for the atrocity. But the tribe of Benjamin, instead of complying, chose to defend their guilty kinsmen. This decision escalated the situation, leading to one of the bloodiest conflicts in Israel's history. The war wasn't just about punishing the men who had committed the crime. It became a battle between brothers, a tragic reminder of how sin and moral decay can tear apart even the closest of communities. In the end, thousands of Israelites died on both sides. The tribe of Benjamin was nearly wiped out, reduced to 600 men hiding in the wilderness. The devastation didn't stop there. Realizing they had decimated one of their own tribes, the rest of Israel was left with a moral dilemma. They had sworn not to give their daughters in marriage to the Benjamites, but now they faced the potential extinction of an entire tribe. In desperation, they concocted a plan to provide wives for the remaining men of Benjamin. By killing the men of Gilead and taking their women, and later by encouraging the Benjamites to kidnap women during a festival. This series of events demonstrates the tragic cycle of violence and poor decision-making. In their attempt to fix one problem, the Israelites created new ones. The result was widespread suffering, injustice, and the dehumanization of many innocent people. The book of Judges closes with a haunting statement. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This verse is the key to understanding not only this story, but the entire book of Judges. It reveals a nation that had lost its way, a people who had abandoned God's law and instead followed their own flawed judgments. This lack of central leadership and moral direction led to the downward spiral we see throughout Judges. When people are left to their own devices, without accountability or guidance, chaos ensues. The horrific events in Gibeah, the civil war, and the near extinction of the tribe of Benjamin are all symptoms of a deeper problem, the spiritual and moral decline of a nation that had turned away from God. For us today, this serves as a powerful warning. When we reject God's authority and make ourselves the final arbiters of right and wrong, we set ourselves on a path toward destruction. We may not see the consequences immediately, but eventually, the weight of our decisions will catch up with us. As we reflect on this tragic and disturbing story, here are the 5 key lessons we can take away. 1. Accountability is crucial. Without accountability, individuals and societies are prone to moral failure. We all need people and structures in our lives that help keep us in check and prevent us from drifting too far from what is right. 2. Every human being is valuable. The story shows the devastating consequences of dehumanizing others. We must remember that every person is made in the image of God, and we are called to treat each other with dignity, respect, and love. 3. Straying from God leads to disaster. When we drift away from God, we become vulnerable to making decisions that can lead to moral failure and destruction. Staying close to God is essential for living a life of integrity and righteousness. 4. Bad decisions have ripple effects. One poor decision can lead to a cascade of negative consequences. We cannot choose our consequences, and the impact of our choices often extends far beyond ourselves. 5. God's grace is always available. Even in the midst of our worst failures, God's grace can bring redemption. He can take the brokenness of our lives and our decisions and work to restore what has been lost. The story from Judges chapters 19 to 21 is one of the darkest in the Bible. It shows us the depths of human depravity and the tragic consequences of a nation that had lost its moral and spiritual compass. But it also teaches us valuable lessons about the importance of accountability, the value of human life, and the power of God's grace. As we wrestle with this difficult narrative, let us remember that every decision we make matters. We are called to live lives of righteousness, treating others with the dignity they deserve, and staying close to God so that we do not drift into moral and spiritual chaos. If you've stayed with me through this difficult and intense story, I want to sincerely thank you for taking the time to reflect on these important lessons. It's not easy to confront such challenging parts of the Bible, but it's crucial that we learn from them and apply those lessons to our lives. Let's remember to live in a way that honors God, treating others with the dignity they deserve, and staying connected to His truth. If you found value in this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos as we continue exploring deep biblical truths together. Feel free to share your thoughts or questions in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Until next time, take care and God bless you.